Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. Today's topic is Lecture 21, Jacksonian America. Now before we begin, as always, hit pause on this video, jot down the lecture outline, and pay particular attention to those key terms at the top. Make sure you can identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and to their larger historical significance, larger historical context. Now with that, let's begin. Now, we want to do a little bit of review here for a moment and talk about the presidency itself and talk a little bit about politics today. Hey, this is a big change from our last lecture, talking much about things on the ground with the market revolution and the alcoholic republic. But by the 1820s, things began to change politically. And first of all, what begins to change is more and more men are entering political races. They're actively campaigning to be president, campaigning to be a senator, campaigning to be a congressman. Why? Up until this point, up to the 1820s, being a politician was could be seen as a dirty thing or a bad word. And I don't mean this necessarily in a fully negative way, but the reality is, it was a burden to do. It wasn't something to be sought after. It was something that you were kind of burdened with. But that begins to change in the 1820s. So before we begin, let's play a little game for a minute. The game is called So You Want to Be President. Let's look back at our presidents here. Let's see, George Washington, state of Virginia. Again, a good state to be from because of the largest population. John Adams, Massachusetts. Now, it's the oddball in the group, as you can see, followed by Thomas Jefferson, Virginia, James Madison, Virginia, James Monroe, Virginia. So if you want to become president in these early elections, the odds are you might want to be from Virginia. And again, it's the most populous state. It made the most sense. Secondly, a second almost seeming prerequisite, again, not official, but seeming prerequisite, was that you should have held the title of Secretary of State. For example, Thomas Jefferson had been Secretary of State under Washington. Madison, before he became president, was Jefferson's Secretary of State. Monroe was Secretary of State to Madison. Again, it was seen as a stepping stone to the presidency. In other words, what you can say then is there was these two kind of prerequisites: Virginia, Secretary of State. But the larger idea, though, was basically that the president was a group of tight-knit elites who would later emerge to be president. In other words, there's a very small group. But this all begins to change in 1810. Again, not in the presidency yet, but in Congress. Remember, in 1810, we had the election of this new political energy called the Warhawks. And the big difference with them is that, A, they were from these new states out west that had not been states prior to the Revolution. And these were men who were born or came of age after the Revolution. In other words, they have no baggage of the Revolution. They don't remember what it was like to be British. All they know is to be American. And as a result of this, we start seeing their difference in attitudes, their difference in political ideals. And you start seeing all these new states enter the Union. As they do, they begin decreasing the restrictions on who can vote in elections. In other words, they're expanding the citizenry. And thus you're having new types of people, new groups of people beginning to have the opportunity to actually vote for higher offices like Senate and the House of Representatives and eventually President. And so they're no longer worried about bad reputation. They actively seek and pursue political offices. So all of these things begin to coalesce in the election of 1824. 1824 is when things begin to change. Because up until this point, as you can see, we've had essentially this tight-knit group of elites, as you see on the screen. But in 1824, we start seeing a new political energy. if you will. And again, in 1824, we have a new group of people who are from very different backgrounds, different places, who are not Secretary of State. They're also from new states. We also see more men eligible to vote for the first time. And so in 1824, we actually have 5 candidates for president, along with some new political parties. Now, on the left, we have the National Republicans. And you see the candidates John Quincy Adams, Massachusetts, and Henry Clay, Kentucky. And these two men have very similar ideologies. Now, of course, Adams was the son of a former president, John Adams. And of course, Henry Clay is from Kentucky, one of those new states. Now, National Republicans are a lot like the former Federalist Party. They want an active, big federal government. Again, this is a big change for people like Henry Clay, who was once kind of a Jeffersonian. But he has seen the light in the sense of the War of 1812, the American system. This is a big, active federal government. He felt it was not complete. And so they want the government to be involved in developing the economy. On the far right, you see Andrew Jackson and William Crawford, Democratic Republicans. Again, they're following the lineage of the Jeffersonian ideal. Again, these are in many ways the Jeffersonian Democratic Republicans. They advocate for a small federal government. They want the government out of the economy. And then in the middle, you see the picture of John C. Calhoun, South Carolina. Why is he in the center? Well, because politically he was in the center. He, on some respect, on some things, supported the big government. Like he liked infrastructure. On the other hand, on other issues, he will also wants the government to stay out of the way. He wants states' rights, especially on the issues of slavery. He's from South Carolina. And what you see here is, notice, none of them are from Virginia. Tennessee, Kentucky are brand new states since the Revolution. And of course, Calhoun and Henry Clay are the two that were voted in during that election of 1810. And what we find here is that we have 5 men running for president in 1824. Now, very quickly, they all look around saying, wow, 5 is way too many. And so Calhoun looks around and says, wow, I don't really stand a chance. Or like, I'm kind of in the middle here. Like, I don't have a specific political party. Therefore, it'll be hard to define for people to vote for me. And so he says, you know what, guys? I'll tell you what. There's too many of us here. How about I step out? I'll step down. I'll back off. I will no longer run for president. But I'll make you a deal. Whichever 4 of you win, I'll be your vice president. And all 4 men agree to this. So basically, we're down to 4 now. And whoever wins will get John C. Calhoun as the vice president. And so the results come in. And again, look at the Electoral College here. Jackson gets 99, Adams gets 84, Crawford gets 41, and Henry Clay, poor Henry Clay, only gets 37 votes. Electoral College. So who wins the election? I bet you're all thinking Andrew Jackson. And I understand why you think that he has the most votes. But remember, to win the Electoral College, you have to win 50% of the votes plus 1. No candidate won 50% of the votes plus 1. And thus, we're going to a runoff again. It's the second time in history, much like we already had one once between Jefferson and Aaron Burr. So, of course, the House will decide who will become the next president now, not the people. Now, William Crawford, in addition to not being very popular, he was really old. And actually, after the election in November, he will suffer a debilitating stroke. And so basically, he is now eliminated as a potential presidential candidate. So now we're down to 3 candidates for the House to choose from: Jackson, John Quincy Adams, or Henry Clay. Now, of course, like we talked about this before, one of the most important figures in the House of Representatives, of course, is the Speaker of the House. And it just so happens that the Speaker of the House of Representatives in 1824 was none other than Henry Clay. Now, so in other words, Henry Clay is going to have a tremendous say in who becomes the next president in 1824. Now, obviously, he can't pick himself. He only has 37 electoral votes compared to 99 and 84. That would be stupid. So who does he pick then? Who should he put his weight behind and try to convince his constituents to vote for in the House of Representatives? Well, let me back up here. Who should Henry Clay choose? Andrew Jackson, someone of the opposite political persuasion, or John Quincy Adams, someone who belongs to the same political ideologies, National Republican Party? Of course he's going to pick John Quincy Adams because they believe in the same political ideals. And so, sure enough, 1824, John Quincy Adams becomes the winner, becomes the next president. Now, Adams is going to spend a quote-unquote miserable 4 years. And again, I'm not going to say he was the worst president ever or anything, but he knows a rematch is coming in 1828. Because, quite honestly, Andrew Jackson is pissed. He feels that he got screwed over, and he has a point. He had more electoral votes and still lost. And basically, he feels he lost because Henry Clay voted for, partisan politics. And again, he has a point. And so we have the rematch between John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson in 1828. Everyone knows it's coming, and it does. Now look at these two pictures for a minute now. Compare them in your minds. On the left, you have John Quincy Adams. He appears smart, intelligent. He's a reader of books, like the libraries, and he has a book in his hands. He has a life of privilege and wealth. He's the son of a president, and of course the incumbent president. On the other standpoint, you have the rugged General Andrew Jackson on a horse, in full military regalia, the hero of the Battle of New Orleans. And of course, Adams believes in big government. Jackson believes in small government. Again, these are two very opposing candidates. They're diametric opposites. They're polar opposites. This would have been one of those great elections to debate the issues, big versus small government. Talk about these differing political ideologies for the future of America. Yeah, right. What fun is that? The election of 1828 turns into one of the dirtiest, mudslinging campaigns in U.S. history. And yes, I'm including that in our current politics when candidates are tweeting back and forth, calling each other all sorts of made-up names. So instead of talking about political ideology, they talk about each other. They criticize Adams for being, well, a person of wealth and privilege. This became a personal attack campaign of the highest order. Again, had there been Twitter back then, there would have been tweet storms. And of course, Andrew Jackson is going to accuse John Quincy Adams of a number of things. He accuses John Quincy Adams of being part of the aristocracy. He accused him of his supposed privileges that had just granted him this position. Then he even accused John Quincy Adams of being a pimp. Yes, you heard me right. He accused John Quincy Adams of being a pimp. I told you this was dirty. Now, is there any validity to this? Yeah. Because as a teenager, when his father was president, he had been the ambassador to Russia. As a teenager, he was ambassador to Russia. And one of his jobs as he was ambassador to Russia was to procure foreign diplomats with good food and entertainment. And so, yeah, at the age of 14, he kind of was a pimp. Now, of course, Jackson, he was a war hero. He beat up the British. He beat up the Native Americans. But John Quincy Adams said he had a gambling problem. a drinking problem. He was a dueler, short-tempered, lacked education. He's a cockfighter. He wasn't good with money, on the verge of bankruptcy. And to all these things, Jackson said, yep. He wore them proudly. Yeah, when people would challenge him, he would respond by challenging them to a duel. He was a gambler. He was active in cockfighting. He did drink a lot. And he had a very foul mouth. I mean, the kind that he cursed more than a drunk sailor does. The kind of person you don't want to bring home to your mom. How do we know this? Well, the fact is, when he died, they have his funeral, and one of his prized possessions was a pet parrot. And during the funeral, they actually had to remove the parrot from the funeral hall because the parrot kept repeating obscenities and squawking out all these obscenities that he had heard Andrew Jackson say over the years, because parrots parrot what their owner says. It's a great story, but it highlights just how foul-mouthed he was. And again, Andrew Jackson to all these said, thank you, yes I am. He took pride in these character traits. So John Quincy Adams pushed further and brought the women of Jackson's life into the fray. Adams attacked Jackson's wife of being an adulterer. She was, technically. The fact is, she had married someone who had left her to go out west to start a new life, and was going to call her when he settled himself, and she joined him out in the west. Well, after 7 years, she kind of presumed he was dead, and she remarried. She married Andrew Jackson. Well, then husband number one shows back up alive and well, says, hey, honey, I'm home. And she's like, I thought you were dead. I'm remarried. So technically speaking, she was married to 2 guys at the same time. So yeah, legally speaking, that's adultery. But then John Quincy Adams brought Andrew Jackson's mama into the debate. He brought Andrew Jackson's mama, accusing her of being a prostitute, and worse, accused her of willingly having an affair with a black man. Now, I understand this nowadays is not quite as bad, but think of how bad this was back in the 1820s when African Americans were seen as a lower subspecies of human, and a white woman, Andrew Jackson's mama, was supposedly debasing herself to sleep with a subhuman person and doing it willingly. This was an ultimate insult. This campaign was about character assassination. I told you, 21st century politics ain't got nothing on these two. But the thing is, and you should know this very well from the 2016 election, mudslinging politics does one thing really well. It gets good ratings, and it brings people to the ballot box. People turn out to vote. And sure enough, Andrew Jackson took all these attacks and said, response to it was, quote, do you want a man who can write, or do you want a man who can fight? Because Jackson portrayed himself as the everyman, as a common man, a man of the people. But the reality he was not a common man. Most people were not military war heroes. He was also a slaveholder. Most, even in the South, were not slaveholders. In fact, he purchased his very first slave purchase was a 19-year-old woman who coincidentally had a child just 19 months later. A biracial child. But this character assassination mudslinging campaign worked. 4 times as many people turned out to vote in 1828 as they did in 1824. Again, can you just imagine if Twitter was invented back then? In the popular vote, Jackson wins 56% of the popular vote, the highest percentage in the 19th century. He won 68% of the electoral vote. Adams only took the states in the Northeast. So Jackson made no mistake this time. He is the new president, winning easily in this mudslinging affair. And he will become president, our seventh president, and he will have some three overarching guidelines, convictions, if you will. Number one, he believed in majority rule. What the people want, that's what should be done. So majority rule. Number two, limited federal government. So he wants that Jeffersonian idea of smaller government. And number three, government should only be used to protect the people. So he has these kind of guiding principles here, right? Majority rules and limited government. Government should only be used to protect the people. Those are his guiding principles. And of course, Jackson will have a couple of major events that will dominate his presidency, and heavily on economic issues as well. But we'll talk about those in his presidency in our next lecture in part 2. So until then, take care and bye-bye.